The morning of August 5, 1964, dawned hot and humid over the Gulf of Tonkin, the air thick with the promise of monsoon rains that would come later in the season. Lieutenant Junior Grade Everett Alvarez Jr., a 26-year-old naval aviator from Salinas, California, climbed into the cockpit of his Douglas A-4 Skyhawk aboard the USS Constellation CV-64, with the same mixture of anticipation and focus that accompanied every combat mission. The son of Mexican immigrant parents, Alvarez had worked his way through Santa Clara University and Navy Flight School, earning his wings and the right to fly one of the Navy's most capable attack aircraft. He was living his dream, serving his country as a carrier-based pilot, but he had no way of knowing that this particular mission would transform him from a promising young officer into a symbol of endurance, resistance, and survival that would inspire a nation. The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. In response to reported attacks on U.S. Navy destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, incidents that would later become controversial and heavily scrutinized by historians, President Lyndon B. Johnson had authorized retaliatory strikes against North Vietnamese naval facilities. Alvarez and his squadron mates were tasked with attacking patrol boat bases along Ha Long Bay, a strategically important area where the North Vietnamese Navy staged operations against South Vietnamese and American vessels. The A-4 Skyhawk was perfect for this type of mission. Small, agile, and capable of delivering a substantial payload of bombs and rockets against coastal targets. As Alvarez ran through his pre-flight checklist, he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that every combat pilot experiences before launching into hostile territory. The catapult officer gave the signal, the steam catapult roared to life, and Alvarez's Skyhawk shot off the deck of the Constellation, accelerating from 0 to over 150 miles per hour in less than 2 seconds. The flight to the target area took less than an hour, and Alvarez formed up with his squadron mates as they approached the North Vietnamese coast. Below them, the emerald waters of Ha Long Bay sparkled in the morning sun, dotted with the distinctive limestone karsts that made the area one of the most beautiful natural wonders in Southeast Asia. But Alvarez wasn't sightseeing. His attention was focused on the patrol boat base that was now visible ahead, with several vessels moored at the docks and military structures visible along the shoreline. The strike leader called out the attack sequence, and one by one, the Skyhawks rolled into their bombing runs, diving toward the target with their bomb racks loaded. Alvarez could see anti-aircraft fire beginning to rise from the ground, streams of tracers that looked deceptively slow and lazy as they climbed toward the attacking aircraft, though he knew they were moving at hundreds of feet per second. He pickled off his bombs, felt the aircraft shudder as the ordnance released, and began his pullout, rolling the Skyhawk into a climbing turn that would take him away from the target area and back toward the relative safety of the Gulf. That's when his aircraft was hit. There was a tremendous bang, and the Skyhawk shuddered violently. Alvarez's instrument panel lit up with warning lights, and he could feel the aircraft beginning to lose control. He'd been struck by anti-aircraft fire, probably a 37mm or 57mm shell, and the damage was catastrophic. The Skyhawk was losing hydraulic pressure, the controls were becoming mushy and unresponsive, and smoke was beginning to fill the cockpit. Alvarez tried everything he could think of to regain control, working the stick and rudder pedals, adjusting the throttle, but the aircraft was dying beneath him. He was too low and too close to enemy territory to make it back to the Constellation, and he knew that within seconds, the Skyhawk would either explode or enter an unrecoverable spin. There was only one option left. Alvarez reached between his legs and pulled the ejection handle, triggering the explosive charges that would blow him clear of the doomed aircraft. The canopy separated with a bang, and a split second later, the rocket motor in his ejection seat fired, blasting him upward and away from the disintegrating Skyhawk. The force of the ejection was tremendous, like being kicked by a mule, and for a moment Alvarez was disoriented, tumbling through space as the automatic systems in his ejection seat deployed his parachute. The violent opening shock of the parachute brought him back to full awareness, and he found himself hanging beneath the canopy, watching his aircraft cartwheel into the ground and explode in a ball of orange flame. Alvarez looked around frantically, trying to assess his situation. He was descending toward the water near the shore, close enough to the beach that he could see North Vietnamese soldiers running along the waterline, pointing up at him and his parachute. He fumbled with his survival radio, trying to call for rescue, but he knew it was hopeless. He was too close to shore, and there were too many enemy forces in the area for a rescue helicopter to attempt to pick up. All he could do was prepare himself for what was coming next. He hit the water hard, the parachute collapsing around him, and he quickly released his harness and inflated his life vest. For a few moments, he considered trying to swim out to sea, hoping that a rescue helicopter might spot him and attempt to pick up before the North Vietnamese could reach him. But the shore was too close and the enemy soldiers were already launching boats. Within minutes, he was surrounded by North Vietnamese patrol boats. There, crews pointing rifles and machine guns at him while shouting in Vietnamese. Alvarez raised his hands, treading water, and watched as several soldiers dove into the water and swam toward him. They grabbed him roughly, binding his hands with rope, and dragged him toward one of the boats. As they pulled him aboard, Alvarez felt a sick realization settling over him. He was now a prisoner of war, and he had no idea how long this nightmare would last. In that moment, as the patrol boat turned toward shore with him trussed up like a captive animal, Everett Alvarez Jr. became the first American pilot shot down and captured over North Vietnam during what would become the longest and most controversial conflict in American history. And he would remain a prisoner for the next 8.5 years, making him the second longest held prisoner of war in American military history, surpassed only by Floyd James Thompson, an Army Special Forces officer who was captured in South Vietnam and held for 9 years. The patrol boat carrying Alvarez reached the shore, and he was roughly hauled onto the beach by his captors, who surrounded him with rifles pointed at his head and chest. A crowd of civilians had gathered, drawn by the excitement of the air raid and the capture of an American pilot, and Alvarez could see hatred in their eyes as they shouted and gestured at him. Some threw stones and sticks, and the soldiers had to push them back to prevent the mob from attacking him. He was placed in the back of a military truck, his hands still bound, and driven inland through a series of small villages where more crowds gathered to jeer and throw objects at the vehicle. The journey lasted several hours, with multiple stops where Alvarez was questioned by North Vietnamese officers who spoke broken English and demanded to know details about his mission, his aircraft carrier, and American military plans. Alvarez gave them only his name, rank, service number, and date of birth, as required by the Code of Conduct for American military personnel. But his interrogators weren't satisfied with this limited information. They threatened him, told him he was a war criminal who could be executed, and warned him that cooperation was his only chance for survival. Alvarez remained silent, refusing to provide any information beyond the basics, and after each interrogation session, he was thrown back into the truck and the journey continued. Finally, after what seemed like an endless trip through the Vietnamese countryside, the truck arrived in Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, and Alvarez caught his first glimpse of the prison where he would spend the next 8.5 years of his life. Hoa Lo Prison had been built by French colonial authorities in the late 19th century to house Vietnamese political prisoners, and it was a massive, imposing structure with high walls, guard towers, and heavy gates topped with barbed wire and broken glass. The Vietnamese had continued to use it after the French withdrew, and it had become a notorious facility where political dissidents and criminals were held in brutal conditions. American POWs would eventually give it a darkly ironic nickname, the Hanoi Hilton. But there was nothing comfortable or hospitable about the place. Alvarez was processed through the prison's intake system, photographed, stripped of his flight suit and personal belongings, and issued a set of thin cotton pajamas that would serve as his prison uniform. He was then taken to a section of the prison that American POWs would later call the Heartbreak Hotel, a group of cells used specifically for processing and interrogating newly captured prisoners. The cell was tiny, perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, with bare concrete walls, a concrete sleeping platform, and a single barred window high up near the ceiling that let in a shaft of weak sunlight. The door was solid steel with a small hatch through which guards could observe the prisoners, and Alvarez could hear sounds from other cells. Coughs, the shuffle of feet, the clang of metal doors, that told him he wasn't alone in this place, though he couldn't see or communicate with any other prisoners. The interrogations began almost immediately. According to later accounts from Alvarez and other POWs, the North Vietnamese interrogation system was designed to break prisoners psychologically, using a combination of isolation, sleep deprivation, inadequate food, threats, and occasionally physical torture to extract information and propaganda statements that could be used against the United States. From mid-September 1965 to November of that year, Alvarez endured marathon interrogation sessions that lasted 8 hours a day, day after day, with no breaks or respite. He was brought before various interrogators, some of whom the American POWs would later give colorful nicknames like Rabbit, Eagle, and Pigaye, based on their physical characteristics or behavior, who demanded that he confess to war crimes, provide detailed information about American military operations, and sign statements denouncing the United States and praising North Vietnam. Alvarez refused every demand, citing the Code of Conduct and insisting that he was a prisoner of war entitled to protection under the Geneva Conventions. His interrogators responded with increasing hostility, threatening him with execution, showing him propaganda photos of other prisoners who had supposedly been killed, and warning him that his family would never know what happened to him if he continued to resist. When threats didn't work, they tried different tactics, offering him better food, medical care, and improved conditions if he would cooperate, or subjecting him to psychological pressure by telling him that the war was over, that America had abandoned him, and that cooperation was his only rational choice. Through it all, Alvarez maintained his resistance, drawing on his inner strength, his faith, and his commitment to his duty as a naval officer. When he refused to cooperate, the North Vietnamese responded by placing him in isolation, confining him to his cell around the clock with minimal human contact and nothing to do except sit and think. For 13 months, more than a year, Alvarez was kept in solitary confinement, unable to communicate with another American prisoner, unable to hear a friendly voice or receive any word from home. The psychological torture of this isolation was devastating, pushing Alvarez to the brink of despair as the days blurred into weeks and the weeks stretched into months with no end in sight. The physical conditions in Hoa Lo were equally brutal, designed to weaken the prisoners both physically and mentally. It wasn't long after his arrival that Alvarez grew seriously ill, thanks to the inedible quality of the food provided to POWs by those overseeing the prison camp. The daily rations consisted of thin soup made with rotten vegetables, occasional portions of rice that were often contaminated with bugs and rat droppings, and sometimes pieces of fish or meat that had spoiled in the tropical heat and emitted a nauseating stench. Alvarez tried to force himself to eat, knowing that he needed calories to survive, but his body rejected the contaminated food, and he began suffering from severe dysentery and malnutrition. He dropped 40 pounds in a matter of weeks, his body wasting away as the illness ravaged his digestive system and left him too weak to stand. He couldn't hold anything down, vomiting up what little food he managed to swallow, and he began to fear that he would die from starvation or disease in this miserable cell, thousands of miles from home, without anyone even knowing what had happened to him. His guards noticed his deteriorating condition, not out of any humanitarian concern, but because they didn't want their prisoners dying before they could be exploited for propaganda purposes, and they finally provided him with rice soup, a thin but more digestible mixture that offered much more sustenance than the rotten fish and animal hooves he had been fed. Gradually, painstakingly, Alvarez began to recover, though he would struggle with health problems throughout his captivity. By mid-1965, as more American servicemen were shot down and captured over North Vietnam, the population of American POWs at Hoa Lo and other prison camps began to grow, and with it came the opportunity for the prisoners to organize and resist their captors more effectively. Despite the harsh conditions, constant surveillance, and severe punishments for any form of communication between prisoners, an underground communications network began to develop within the prison walls. American POWs, drawing on their military training, their ingenuity, and their determination to maintain unit cohesion even in captivity, devised various methods to communicate with each other without being detected by the guards. They used a tap code based on a 5x5 letter grid, where each letter of the alphabet could be represented by a sequence of taps on the wall. The letter K was omitted, and C was used in its place to complete the 25-letter grid. They scratched messages on the bottoms of food bowls or drinking cups that could be passed from cell to cell. They communicated through subtle hand signals during the rare moments when they were allowed out of their cells for washing or using the latrine. They even developed a cough code where different patterns of coughs could convey simple messages or acknowledgments. It wasn't long before Alvarez was able to begin sending messages to other POWs by scratching notes onto kitchen cutlery with a nail or piece of wire he had managed to conceal, carefully etching letters into the metal surface of spoons and bowls that would be collected by guards and redistributed to other prisoners during mealtimes. These scratched messages were crude and required careful attention to decode, but they represented a lifeline for the isolated prisoners, a way to share information about who was being held where, what the North Vietnamese were demanding, and how the other POWs were holding up under the brutal conditions. The senior-ranking American officers among the POWs worked to establish a chain of command and a unified resistance strategy, recognizing that their best hope for survival lay in maintaining discipline and supporting each other against their captors' efforts to break them individually. Navy Commander James Stockdale, the senior naval aviator held at Hoa Lo, emerged as the de facto leader of the American POWs, issuing orders through the TAP code network that emphasized resistance to North Vietnamese demands for information and propaganda statements. Stockdale's guidance was clear. Resist to the point of permanent injury but not death. Acknowledge that everyone has a breaking point under torture but recover and resist again, and never give the enemy anything voluntarily. This philosophy, which came to be known as bounce back, recognized the reality that torture could force compliance but emphasized that prisoners should resist as much as possible, refuse to feel guilty when they reached their breaking point, and immediately resume resistance once the pressure let up. For Alvarez, who had already demonstrated his commitment to resistance during his early months in captivity, this guidance reinforced his determination to maintain his honor and his duty as a naval officer even in the most desperate circumstances. He drew strength from knowing that other Americans were being held nearby, that they were all resisting together, and that their sacrifices were not in vain even if years passed without their release. The North Vietnamese, frustrated by the American POW's continued resistance and their ability to communicate despite all efforts to isolate them, responded with increasingly harsh measures designed to break the prisoners' will. They implemented a system they called attitude adjustment, which involved subjecting uncooperative prisoners to torture sessions designed to force compliance with demands for confessions, propaganda statements, or military information. The torture methods varied but were universally brutal. Prisoners were forced to kneel on concrete floors for hours with their arms extended until they collapsed from exhaustion. They were placed in leg irons that cut into their flesh. They were subjected to rope torture, where their arms were bound behind their backs with ropes that were progressively tightened until the shoulders were dislocated and the circulation was cut off. They were beaten with bamboo clubs or rubber hoses. They were denied sleep for days on end. They were locked in tiny punishment cells where they couldn't stand or lie down comfortably. Alvarez experienced many of these tortures during his years at Hoa Lo, enduring pain and degradation that would have broken lesser men. But he survived by focusing on his faith, his duty, and his determination to return home with honor. He learned to compartmentalize the pain, to retreat into his mind and think about his family, his home in California, and the life he would build when he finally gained his freedom. He developed mental exercises to keep his mind sharp, reciting poems and prayers he had memorized, working through mathematical problems in his head, and imagining detailed scenarios of what he would do when he returned to the United States. These mental survival techniques, combined with the support he received from fellow POWs through the TAP code network, helped him endure years of captivity that would have driven many people insane. As the months stretched into years, Alvarez and his fellow POWs settled into the grim routine of prison life, marking time by scratching notches on their cell walls, calculating the passage of seasons by the temperature and the angle of sunlight through their high windows, and holding on to hope that the war would end and they would finally be released. The North Vietnamese occasionally provided them with news, always propaganda-laden and unreliable, about the progress of the war, telling them that American forces were being defeated, that the anti-war movement in the United States was growing, and that they had been forgotten by their government and their countrymen. The POWs learned to disbelieve everything their captors told them, understanding that psychological warfare was as much a weapon as physical torture, and they passed what real information they could glean through their communication network, trying to build an accurate picture of the outside world from the fragments they could gather. Occasionally, newly captured pilots would arrive at Hoa Lo with fresh information about the war's progress, about political developments in the United States, and about the growing awareness of the POW situation among the American public. These reports were eagerly shared. Through the TAP code network, giving the long-held prisoners like Alvarez crucial information about the changing circumstances that might eventually lead to their release. The years of captivity took a profound toll on Alvarez, as they did on all the American POWs. The physical effects were obvious: chronic health problems from the poor food and untreated injuries, dental problems from lack of care, vision problems from years in dimly lit cells, and the lasting effects of torture that would cause pain for the rest of their lives. But the psychological effects were even more profound. The isolation, the uncertainty, the constant psychological pressure, and the knowledge that years of their lives were being stolen from them created wounds that were harder to see but no less real. Alvarez struggled with depression, with moments of despair when he wondered if he would ever see his family again or if he would die in this miserable cell on the other side of the world. He struggled with guilt over the mission that had brought him here, wondering if the war was worth the sacrifice he and his fellow POWs were making. He struggled with anger at his captors, at the politicians who had sent him to Vietnam, and at the circumstances that had placed him in this situation. But through all these struggles, he maintained his core identity as a naval officer and an American, refusing to let his captors break his spirit even when they had broken his body. This inner strength, this refusal to surrender his essential humanity and dignity, defined Alvarez and his fellow POWs and would eventually inspire a nation when their stories finally became known. The years of Alvarez's captivity coincided with the most intense and controversial period of the Vietnam War. As American involvement escalated dramatically, domestic opposition to the war grew into a major political movement, and the conflict became a defining issue in American politics and society. While Alvarez sat in his cell at Hoa Lo, American troop levels in Vietnam rose to over 500,000. Major battles like the Tet Offensive shocked the American public. Anti-war protests erupted on college campuses and in major cities. President Johnson declined to seek re-election largely because of the war's unpopularity, and President Richard Nixon was elected on a promise to end American involvement through a policy of Vietnamization that would gradually transfer responsibility for the fighting to South Vietnamese forces. Through all these developments, which the POWs learned about in fragmented and distorted form through their captors' propaganda and occasional reports from newly captured servicemen, Alvarez and his fellow prisoners held on to the hope that negotiations would eventually lead to their release. There were moments of false hope, times when rumors circulated through the TAP code network that a peace agreement was imminent and the POWs would soon be going home, only to have those hopes dashed when the negotiations broke down or when newly captured prisoners arrived with news that the war was continuing. The psychological impact of these ups and downs was devastating, and the POWs learned to guard against optimism even as they desperately wanted to believe that their ordeal would soon end. In 1969, the treatment of American POWs at Hoa Lo and other North Vietnamese prisons improved somewhat, not out of any humanitarian impulse, but because of international pressure and changing political calculations in Hanoi. The death of Ho Chi Minh in September 1969 led to changes in North Vietnamese policy, and the new leadership recognized that better treatment of American POWs might provide diplomatic advantages in the ongoing peace negotiations. The food improved slightly, the frequency of torture sessions decreased, and some prisoners were allowed limited opportunities to communicate with each other and even to write brief letters home. Heavily censored, of course, but still the first contact many POWs had had with their families in years. For Alvarez, who had been held incommunicado for most of his captivity, the opportunity to send a letter to his family was emotionally overwhelming, and he struggled to compress years of experience and emotion into the brief, censored message he was allowed to write. He told his family that he was alive and thinking of them, that he was holding up as well as could be expected, and that he hoped to see them again soon. Simple words that carried the weight of years of suffering and longing. The breakthrough finally came in 1973, after years of on-and-off negotiations between the United States and North Vietnam. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, provided for a ceasefire in Vietnam, the withdrawal of American forces, and the release of all American POWs. When the news reached Hoa Lo, the prisoners could hardly believe it after so many false hopes and disappointments, but this time it was real. The North Vietnamese began organizing the POWs for release, moving them to different sections of the prison, providing them with new clothes, and preparing them for their journey home. The official policy was that POWs would be released in the order they had been captured, which meant that Alvarez, as the first American pilot shot down over North Vietnam, would be among the first group to go home. On February 12, 1973, 8 years, 6 months, and 7 days after he had been shot down over Halong Bay, Everett Alvarez Jr. and a group of other American POWs were transported to Gia Lam Airport in Hanoi, where American Air Force transport planes were waiting to take them home. The scene at the airport was surreal, with the POWs barely able to process what was happening as they were formally turned over to American military personnel and escorted onto the waiting aircraft. As Alvarez climbed the steps to the plane and stepped inside, surrounded by American servicemen and American flags, the reality of his freedom finally began to sink in. He was going home. After more than 8 years in hell, he was finally going home. The flight to the Philippines, where the released POWs would undergo medical evaluation and debriefing before continuing to the United States, was filled with emotion as the former prisoners tried to process their liberation and adjust to the reality that their ordeal was finally over. They were still wary, half expecting some trick or last-minute reversal. But as the aircraft gained altitude and Hanoi disappeared below them, they began to believe that they were truly free. Medical personnel aboard the plane conducted preliminary health checks and were shocked by the physical condition of many of the POWs, who showed the effects of years of malnutrition, untreated injuries, and torture. Alvarez had lost a significant amount of weight. His body bore the scars of his captivity, and he would require extensive medical treatment to address the various health problems he had developed during his imprisonment. But none of that mattered in the moment. He was free, he was with his fellow Americans, and he was heading home. The arrival of the first group of released POWs in the Philippines was an international media event, with journalists and cameras documenting every moment as the men stepped off the aircraft and onto Philippine soil, the first free ground they had walked on in years. The images of these returning heroes, thin and scarred but standing proud in their new uniforms, saluting the flag and shaking hands with military officers, became iconic symbols of American resilience and sacrifice. From the Philippines, Alvarez and the other released POWs were flown to military hospitals in the United States, where they underwent extensive medical evaluation, physical therapy, psychological counseling, and debriefing sessions where intelligence officers documented their experiences in captivity. The transition from prisoner to free man was not easy, and many POWs struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, dealing with nightmares, flashbacks, difficulty adjusting to normal life, and complex emotions about their captivity and the war that had claimed so many years of their lives. But Alvarez was determined to rebuild his life and move forward, drawing on the same inner strength that had sustained him through 8.5 years in Hoa Lo. Everett Alvarez Jr. returned to a country that had changed dramatically during his years in captivity, transformed by the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, the civil rights struggle, and profound social and cultural shifts that would have been unimaginable when he had flown off the deck of the Constellation in 1964. The homecoming for Vietnam veterans was often difficult and ambiguous, with many Americans conflicted about the war and uncertain how to honor veterans of a conflict that remained controversial and divisive. But the returning POWs received a different reception, celebrated as heroes who had endured terrible suffering and maintained their honor under the most extreme circumstances. Alvarez participated in numerous public events, gave interviews to media outlets, and was honored by military and civilian organizations for his service and sacrifice. He remained in the Navy after his release, eventually rising to the rank of commander and serving in various capacities before retiring from active duty in 1980 to pursue a career in civilian life. He earned a law degree from George Washington University and went on to serve in various government positions, including Deputy Director of the Peace Corps and Deputy Administrator of the Veterans Administration, using his experience and his public profile to advocate for veterans and to ensure that the sacrifices of servicemen and women were recognized and honored. Throughout his post-captivity life, Alvarez has remained active in veterans affairs and has worked to keep alive the memory of the POW experience and the lessons learned from that difficult chapter in American history. He has written about his experiences, including a memoir that details his years in captivity and his journey to recovery and renewal. He has spoken to schools, military groups, and civic organizations about duty, honor, sacrifice, and resilience, sharing the story of how he and his fellow POWs survived their ordeal and maintained their humanity in the face of brutal treatment. He has remained close to many of his fellow POWs, recognizing that the bonds formed in captivity, the shared suffering, the mutual support through the TAP Code network, and the collective resistance to their captors, created connections that would last a lifetime. These men, who had endured hell together, maintained a special brotherhood based on their shared experience and their understanding of what each had sacrificed and endured. Alvarez has also worked to ensure that the POW MIA issue remains a priority for the American government and the American people, advocating for continued efforts to account for all servicemen who remain missing from the Vietnam War and other conflicts and to provide closure for their families. Now, decades after his release and more than half a century after he was shot down over North Vietnam, Everett Alvarez Jr. is slated to receive the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor that the United States Congress can bestow. The Congressional Gold Medal is awarded by special act of Congress to individuals who have performed notable achievements and contributions to American society, and it represents the nation's highest expression of appreciation for distinguished service and accomplishment. Previous recipients include George Washington, the Wright brothers, Rosa Parks, Mother Teresa, Winston Churchill, the Tuskegee Airmen, and the astronauts of Apollo 11, placing Alvarez in truly extraordinary company. The decision to award the Congressional Gold Medal to Alvarez recognizes not only his personal sacrifice and heroism, but also the broader story of all American POWs who endured captivity during the Vietnam War, maintaining their honor and their duty under circumstances that tested the limits of human endurance. The medal acknowledges that Alvarez's story represents something larger than one man's experience. It represents the best of American values, the commitment to duty and honor even in the darkest circumstances, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. The award of the Congressional Gold Medal to Everett Alvarez Jr. serves multiple purposes beyond simply honoring one man's exceptional service and sacrifice. It reminds all Americans of the cost of freedom and the sacrifices made by those who serve in uniform, particularly during times of war when servicemen and women risk not only their lives but potentially years of captivity and suffering if they are captured by enemy forces. It honors the specific experience of POWs, a group whose suffering is often overlooked in discussions of war, but who endure unique hardships that can last for years or even decades. It acknowledges that the Vietnam War, despite its controversial nature and the divisions it created in American society, was fought by honorable men and women who deserved respect and recognition for their service regardless of one's views about the war's conduct or outcome. And it serves as a reminder to current and future generations that duty, honor, and sacrifice remain essential values in American life, that there are principles worth fighting for and worth enduring hardship to uphold, and that individuals can make extraordinary contributions through their courage and their refusal to surrender their humanity, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. For Alvarez himself, the Congressional Gold Medal represents a culmination of a journey that began on the deck of the USS Constellation on a hot August morning in 1964, and has continued through 8.5 years of captivity, decades of service to veterans and to the nation, and a lifetime of carrying the memories and the lessons of his experience as a POW. In accepting this honor, he accepts it not just for himself but for all the American POWs who shared his experience, for those who survived and those who did not, for those who returned home and those whose remains were never recovered, and for the families who waited and hoped and endured their own form of captivity while their loved ones were held in North Vietnamese prisons. The medal recognizes that Alvarez's story is part of a larger narrative of American resilience, courage, and commitment to values that transcend individual comfort or safety, and it ensures that this story will be remembered and honored by future generations of Americans who will look back on the Vietnam War and seek to understand what it meant and what it cost. As Everett Alvarez Jr. prepares to receive the Congressional Gold Medal, he reflects on the journey that has brought him to this moment. A journey that began with a young man's dream of serving his country as a naval aviator, continued through the nightmare of 8.5 years in a North Vietnamese prison, and has extended through decades of service to veterans and to the nation. He thinks about the men he served with, both those who made it home and those who did not, and he knows that this honor represents all of them and their collective sacrifice. He thinks about the values that sustained him through his captivity: faith, duty, honor, and love of country, and he hopes that his story will inspire others to embrace these values in their own lives, whatever challenges they may face. And he thinks about the future, about the need to